Hey, and welcome back to another episode of Vibrant You. Today, we are talking about something a bit tender. We're talking about one of the most natural yet difficult and heartbreaking things about being human. We're talking about grief. And whether you're currently experiencing grief or loss or deep sadness or heartache, or you have in the past, or maybe someone around you is currently grieving, then this episode is for you. We're going to talk about what grief is, how to be with it, some new insights and perspectives on how to hold ourselves or our loved ones through grief. And to be honest, this episode feels a bit edgy for me as I'm going to share with you some of my own personal experiences with grief and what I've been crossing in the last few weeks in my own personal life. So let's get into it. First of all, let's talk what is grief. And the way that I see it is that grief is nothing other than love. Some say that grief is love with no place to go, and yet I think that grief is more love that we can learn to redirect in new ways. It seems to me that as a culture, we think of grief a bit narrow-mindedly, and I'm no psychologist and I don't claim to have the perfect answers when it comes to grief, and yet I do have a human heart. And I've studied the mind and my own mind for the last many, many years. And I do have a very close and intimate personal relationship with grief. We have been in a dance for many, many years now. And there's many things that I've come to realize about grief in the last years. And that is that sometimes grief is about losing what was. Losing that person, that relationship, that experience. But often, grief is also about losing what could have been, the dream, the possibility with that person, the future that you had envisioned for yourself with that person or with that relationship or whatever it might have been. And for me, that's a kind of grief that I don't think we give enough credit to. The grief of not only what was, but also what isn't, what won't be and what will never be. So I'm in grief at the moment, and a big piece of grieving is giving it a voice and speaking out loud our pains so that we don't feel so alone in it. So much of our healing is about removing the shame and the isolation that can come with grief and replacing it with love and tenderness, compassion and care. And I know that for myself and what I've seen in clients as well, holding space for their grief and their challenges, this is what enables us to heal our pain, is to feel our pain. So what I'm grieving at the moment and why I'm doing this podcast now is, of course, because that's what's alive in me. This is what's alive in my present lived experience. And so I feel, as I'm sharing this, my palms are sweating and my heart is racing a bit as it feels vulnerable and it feels edgy to share this, and yet this is so important, and I know that these are important conversations, and I've shared some polls on my Instagram story in the last days in relationship to grief, and there's been so many responses of people grieving, and this is such a natural part of our human experience that why do we hide this behind closed doors? Why don't we talk about our pain and talk about our sadness in the most loving and compassionate way? So at the moment, I am grieving a lot, more than I think I realized. My grandfather, the man that raised me, passed away suddenly a couple of weeks ago, and I'm sitting in his house right now. And I see his couch, the place that he used to sit with his little indent. The one side of the couch worn in so much more than the other because that was his spot, and everything in this house is in its perfect place. His belt's beside the bed, his pants, his slacks laid over the chair, ready for him to wake up and wear. His dentures are in his bathroom. His awful, horribly unhealthy milk that only he drank is sitting in his fridge still, and everything is in its place except him. And I, in the last 2 weeks, after he passed suddenly, I flew home to Canada. So I live in Bali, Indonesia, which is very, very far. And I flew home very suddenly to be with my family and to be here and to grieve. And this is my first time coming back to Canada in nearly 6 years. So not only am I grieving the loss of my grandfather, but I'm also grieving, oh my gosh, the accumulation of 6 years and beyond worth of unprocessed stuff that was really easy to stay avoidant to and out of sight, out of mind, living so far away. So I'm grieving the entire time of the pandemic and what happened to the world and how my life and lifestyle changed so dramatically during that time and kept me away from Canada and away from my family, my sisters, who I haven't seen in 5-6 years. I'm noticing being here that I'm grieving past relationships, my ex-fiance of a 5-year relationship, and grieving all that was supposed to be, all that was. And even though I'm in an amazing and beautiful new relationship now, and I love my partner deeply, there's still, it's my first time back in Canada since not being with this person. I know that being here in Canada is a big piece of the healing puzzle for me in kind of, I don't know, I feel like I'm here to grieve and grieve so many different things. So I'm actually going to see my ex-fiance later today for some healing and reconciliation, and that feels really important and scary and all of the things all at once. I'm grieving walking around my mother's house, the house that I grew up in, and every childhood dog that was alive before I left Canada that now isn't there anymore. And I wasn't there to see the aging and to grieve the death when it happened, so here we go. It's coming up now. I'm grieving driving by the apartment in this hometown that I used to live, this apartment that I used to live in with my ex-boyfriend who died by suicide, and all of the pain and the sadness and disappointment of that relationship, even though it was more than 10 years ago. But I've been gone a long time. I'm grieving the loss of my other grandfather, whom I was not nearly as close with, who passed a little less than a year ago. But more than that, even through the process of his death, I'm grieving trying to reconnect with my father, who I hadn't spoken with in over 15 years, and grieving all that never was with him and all that I know can never be with my father. I'm grieving that I haven't had a relationship with my father since I was 12 and that I never will, and that pain runs really deep. I'm grieving that I live so far away from my family, how much I have missed being away, and how I won't be there for everything moving forward because I live far away and I've chosen that. I'm grieving that my future kids won't be raised neighbors with their aunties and their grandmother just down the road. I grieve the birthdays that I will continue to miss and the family gatherings that I won't be there for. And that hurts. It's hard. Life is hard. Sometimes what feels hard doesn't always make it wrong. Hard and wrong aren't always synonyms, and the truth is that being in Canada, it is hard. The possibility of living in Canada, that's hard for me. The culture, the lifestyle, the priorities, the friggin' rules. There's too many rules here. And I know that that's not for me, and so being in Canada is hard for me. Not being in Canada is hard for me. Both are hard. I'm missing my family. I'm missing my roots. There's amazing things of ease and systems and being able to take out money without it being a big deal. And I don't know, there's funny things in Indonesia, silly little bureaucratic things that coming here. I'm like, wow, you can just call the phone company and make things work again. Oh my God. And it's not this 3-month long system. Being in Canada's hard. Not being in Canada's hard. And so the question is what hard do I want to choose? What hard is worth it for me right now? And that means to live in Bali and to choose that life and to make space for the grief and the sadness and the pain of not choosing the other possibility. Sometimes that is what grief is. It's not always the loss of what was or who was, but sometimes it's the loss of the possibilities and the dream and the future that you may have envisioned for yourself and how it might be different. So I want to share with you now my past relationship with grief. So grief and I, we've come a long way. Lots has changed. I, like you and everyone else, I don't like grief. I mean, who does? Loss is horribly painful. It's devastating, it's disorienting, it's exhausting. It's all of it. And I know that I've gotten a lot better over the years. It doesn't hurt any less. I just think I know how to be with it better and how to hold myself through these hard moments. But my lifelong pattern with grief and trauma is a little bit funny. I tend to get, in moments of hardship, I get really affective. Some people shut down, and I certainly have moments of that too. But my overall tendency when I'm grieving or in a trauma response is I tend to go in overdrive. I go in fixing mode. I go into what needs to happen mode, get shit done mode. Or the other side of it is that I desire to intellectualize my way out of grief or out of pain. I did that for so many years, and my own coaches and therapists eventually you're really good at articulating your grief and you're really good at talking about it. And I thought, oh, I'm processing it because I'm talking about my grief. But I was really intellectualizing it, oh, with such a stern face and not an ounce of emotion in my body, I'm feeling sad. I'm grieving right now. And I would use this way of intellectualizing my grief and thinking about it and staying in my head about it, thinking that I'm processing it, to avoid actually feeling the feelings of grief. Because that felt scary to me and that felt too much for me to deal with. And so I'd stay in my head around it. And a lot of people do this. These are very common grief responses. We may shut down. We may go through periods of being unfunctional, and on the other side, we might go into overdrive. We might be more on trying to distract ourselves or stay busy or go into fixing mode, because that gives us this false sense of control in something that feels so utterly uncontrollable, and gives us this sense of power in something that we feel so powerless in. So part of this can be helpful to a degree, right? It's great to be effective in moments of hardship. And part of it too, I think, is an escape. And I know that I've needed to be really honest with myself in my feelings, and to take time to actually feel my feelings, and to cry and to sob and to rage. And there have been plenty of moments of that in the last weeks as well, both with myself in my own solitude, as well as alongside of my family, which feels really important and healing. And so for you, if you yourself are afraid to feel your sadness or feel your grief or feel the natural human rage that may come up around loss, because you're afraid of getting pulled into this downward spiral and getting stuck there forever, you need to know this. It's often not the grief that causes you to spiral. It's often your resistance to feeling that grief, or your identification with that grief, that keeps you stuck in it. You see, grief isn't the problem. Grief is one of the most fundamental, natural parts of our human experience, as painful as it is. But grief is healing. Grief is medicine. Those tears streaming down your face are rinsing the pain out of your body. Those are healing tears. Let them come. It's your relationship to grief and the story that we attach to that grief that makes us stuck in it. And I had a client the other day in my Find Balance program where we go through an entire mind and body healing process. And this client shared to me the other day with deep concern in her eyes as she was grieving. She said, I'm afraid that if I feel this huge mountain of emotion inside of me, that I'm just going to get pulled into this downward spiral of depression and negativity and grief and just never get out. And her concern is valid. No, I've been there. You've been there. Sometimes these emotions feel so big and so overwhelming and so devastating to want to let ourselves to fully open up to. And this is so natural and so common. But here's what I told her, is that this emotion, this grief, is simply energy. It's not bad. Emotion is just energy in motion. That's why we call it emotion, energy in motion. And no emotion is good or bad. It's just a feeling to be felt. It's simply information. And with grief, often our grief and our sadness and our tears is informing us of the deep love that we had and that we still have, and that we need to find new ways to redirect that love. And sometimes this feels really scary and really big and overwhelming and all-consuming. But the truth is that often, maybe about 10% of the emotional intensity that we feel is actually the core emotion of grief. That sadness, that anger, that loss. But what pulls us into that downward spiral that we get really stuck in is actually 90% of the emotional intensity that we feel when we're upset. And that is actually our resistance to feeling the sadness. It's our resistance to feeling the grief that keeps us stuck in it. It's the story that our mind tells us about those emotions and our relationship to those feelings that keep us stuck in them longer than maybe we need to be. And with grief, there is no timeline. And yet I know for me, there's been things in my life where through kind of avoiding grief and not letting myself fully go there and not letting myself fully be sad, I kind of just hang out in this little bit of residual grief for way longer than maybe I need to. And that is a weight on us that can really weigh us down. So how does grief express itself? You can Google the 5 stages of grief. They are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. You can Google that. I have a slightly different experience with grief. For me, grief often starts with what I call the haze. The shock that, fuck, this isn't real. This phase of arguing with reality, this isn't happening. I don't believe this. Fuck that. I think when my grandfather passed, I walked around in this haze for a few days, feeling totally disconnected from my body, very unclear, and yet going through periods of hyperactivity and hyper doing mode, achieving mode, get shit done mode. Because again, gives us that sense of control when everything feels so out of control. So the haze. We might go through periods of anger. I know I have with my grandfather passing. When I heard the news, the first thing that I said is, fuck you, life. Fuck you, life. You ruined the plan. I was supposed to come home in August, and I was going to get to be with my grandfather and my grandmother for the first time in 6 years. The pandemic's finally over. It's easy to travel again. Here I come. I'm ready to go in August. And life had other plans, and I was angry. I was raging, and that still exists in me. I have moments of that. Of feeling well, life, you fucked everything up, didn't you? Grief might express itself as blame. And sometimes this blame, whether we put it on ourselves, whether we put it on the person that just broke up with you, or the person that just died, or the government, right? Blame we can put in so many different directions. But blame is really an attempt to make sense of our pain. It's a way to help us find a source or a reason for it. It helps us discharge or off-put onto something or someone else our discomfort and our pain. We might blame ourselves. We might blame the other person. We might blame something or someone outside. The nurse, the doctor, they should have done more. Your sibling, they should have shown up differently. That blame says it's all your fault, so that we don't have to feel the same level of emotional pain. Grief may express itself as guilt or regret. I know that's come up a lot for me. These stories that I should have done more. I should have called more. Oh, why didn't I come home sooner? I knew this was going to happen. I regret not coming home sooner. I wish that I could have let him know more. And I say this with tears in my eyes. I wish that I could have let him know more how much this man meant to me and how much I loved him. This guilt, this regret, this is such a natural experience in our grief. And our job is to let it come and to be with it and make space for it. Not to convince ourselves, I think out of love, when we say these things I should have done more, I wish I would have done more, should have called more. Who can relate to that, right? Everyone. And I feel like out of love, people come to us and say, oh, you did the best you could, and oh, well, blah, 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 blah. And really, it's their attempt to take your pain away because they're not comfortable with your pain. And they mean well, but the truth is that there is tremendous guilt and there's tremendous regret. And our job isn't to make it wrong. Our job isn't to fix it or to convince ourselves that that guilt and that regret doesn't exist. Our job is to just feel it and to be with it and to let that regret perhaps inform us of another way that feels more aligned in our other relationships and to empower ourselves with what we can do now. We may experience longing. This is so real. Missing them, missing what was, desiring things to be a different way. This longing is so real. And finally, grief, I know for me, expresses itself deeply as love. Grief is love. And having these overwhelming feelings of, oh my God, I love you so much. And I'm so grateful for all the time that we got to spend together and the years that I got to live with my grandfather. I moved out at a very young age and spent a lot of time with my grandfather in another city where he lived. And I'm so incredibly grateful for that time. So how do we grieve? How do we do this thing? The way I see it, there's no right or wrong way. There's maybe healthier and unhealthy ways and coping mechanisms, and everyone's just getting by the best they can with the situation that they're in. But how do we heal? We heal with love. We heal with awareness, with compassion, with wholeness. And wholeness is a key word here because we won't always feel love. We might feel tremendous pain. We may feel devastation. And so making space for all the different parts of grief to express itself, which may be genuine gratitude in moments and genuine guilt in another. So we heal in our wholeness by making space for all the possibilities of how grief may express itself and giving ourselves permission to feel it all. Knowing that what we feel, we heal. How long does it take? I know for me, there's been grieving experiences where I'm like, fuck, I should be over this already. Why is this still coming up? Why am I still crying about this? I should be over this. This was 15 years ago. I've done the therapy. And the truth is that how long does it take? As long as it takes. And grief comes in waves. And we may be feeling really grateful one moment and really sad another, and that's okay. So how do we hold ourselves in grief? We let it come. We make space for all the different parts, and we don't need to get stuck in it. And I know for me, it feels really healthy to have time in my grief and time out of our grief. And I know that when we're in it, when you are in the midst of grief, we don't always have that luxury to choose our time in and our time out, and I get that. And the essence of what I want to say here is that to grieve doesn't mean that you need to be in a constant state of pain. And I know that there's been chapters in my past life where I felt that I almost had to stay in a perpetual state of pain, almost like to take away the pain of others. It's kind of a funny dynamic, but I felt that if I could feel pain all the time, that I could take away the pain of the person that died, or I could take away the pain of the people around me. And the thing is that when it comes to pain, it's not like there's pieces of the pie where if I have this much pain, you're going to have less. Or if you have this much pain, you're going to take away mine. It's this infinite pie of pain that we can all tune into and we can all hold our own in. So I don't need to hold on to anyone else's pain. I can be deeply with someone in their pain because I know how to be in mine. And I think this is one of the greatest things that we can do when we're side by side with someone else's pain is not to try to fix it, not to try to take it away, not to try to say the perfect thing or get it all right. I know that's a big tendency in us, right? Sometimes we'll even avoid the person in pain because we're like, well, I just don't know what to say. And sometimes that's what we should say in those moments. When someone dies, when your friend's going through a horrible breakup, when your friend has a miscarriage, it's not always about getting it right and saying the perfect thing and Googling what to say when someone loses someone and writing it on a card. Sometimes it's just being. Sometimes it's saying, I don't know what to say. This is so horrible that this has happened and I'm so sorry. My heart aches with you. I don't know what to say. And I wish I could take away all of your pain. And I know that I can't. And I know that this hurts and this will continue to hurt. and I'm right by your side. I don't have the perfect thing to say, but I know that I love you and I'm right here with you. This is grief. This is being side by side in relationship with grief. It's so real. So a big insight that I've had around grief is that our job is not to shrink our grief. Our job is not to overcome it. Our only job is to learn how to live with tremendous joy amongst tremendous sorrow. I don't think that the pain of losing our grandfather or our mother or our partner or our dog or an opportunity or a house, I don't think that this pain goes away. I don't think that it shrinks. I think what we do in grief is that we, as a person, learn how to grow around our grief. So imagining that when grief first hits, it's like this ball, this big rock that fills our entire being. It is a mountain inside of us. We don't shrink the mountain. We can't make that pain smaller because that pain is like an injury and it hurts. What we can do is we can grow around that pain, and we can evolve and we can expand our awareness and our life experiences and build new life around this pain. The size of the rock, the pain doesn't change, but you grow physically, emotionally, spiritually around that pain. And so suddenly, in time and in its own time, that pain, that mountain in you doesn't take up the fullness of you. Imagining that that rock took up the entire window of your mind. And in time, we grow that window to be able to see beyond that pain, to find joy around that sorrow. And all of a sudden, in contrast to the fullness of you and your new awareness, the size of that pain hasn't shrunk, but we've grown around it. And so it feels smaller in contrast. And when it comes to grief, we don't have to feel it all at once. There's no right or wrong way. Yes, we want to make space for it. You're also allowed to have time and space outside of your grief. It's not a sentence to lifelong pain, loss. It's about being with all of the different moments that will come up in this journey called healing and allowing that to be. In a relationship with grief that I have cultivated for myself, I call it the alchemy of grief. And that is not to get rid of it, not to shrink it, not to overcome it, but it's to alchemize it. How do we alchemize our grief? We do that by being with it, by feeling it, by allowing that deep, tremendous pain in you to be transformed into power, because pain is power. The alchemy of grief is finding new ways to direct that love that no longer has a source. Often the grief that we feel, at its essence, grief is simply love. And for so long, we've been pouring our love in one direction, into that family member, into that relationship, into that beautiful animal that we've fed and cared for every single day for so many years, into that home that we lived in, into that city that we called home. And it's finding new ways to direct that love. That love is still in you. That love doesn't die because the person did. And often that loss is feeling like I have all of this love inside of me and I don't have a place for it. And that feeling is remarkably overwhelming. And so a piece of alchemizing grief is finding new ways to direct that love. Maybe that means directing that love back to yourself if you're in a breakup. Maybe it means giving back or doing something in the honor of the person that's passed away to live on their legacy. What was a cause or a donation, or what was a mission that that person had in the world, and how can you live that on? How can you carry on their legacy in the world? That is a way of pouring that love in a new direction. So when grief hits, something that I've given myself permission to do is when grief hits, I let myself lose myself in love. The essence of grief is love. And you may be feeling on the surface tremendous sadness or anger or guilt or rage or longing. And so feel that. But remember what's underneath, and that's love. Come back to that love again and again. You're allowed to be sad and come back to that love, because that's what grief is. So that's what I want to say for now on grief. And if you're grieving, I want to say I love you, and I feel your heart, and I see you in your wholeness, and love you in the fullness of what you're crossing, the highs and the lows, of which there might be many. And I'd love to hear you give a voice to this. I'd love to hear over on Instagram. Send me a DM. What are you grieving? What's been the hardest part in that for you? What's helped? Let's spread this message of alchemizing grief even further, loving ourselves through these hard moments and supporting each other in the best possible way. I'm sending you so much love, and I'll see you back here real soon. Take care.